So welcome everyone to this month's installment of our I Can't Believe It's Not Better seminar series. We have the great pleasure of welcoming Anna Korba today. As many of you know, Anna has been doing quite some seminal work on statistical machine learning, mostly in the areas of kernel methods, optimal transport, and ranking. She's done her PhD at Télécom in Paris with Stéphane Clémençon, and then did a postdoc with Arthur Gretton at Gatsby in London. And these days, she's particularly interested in particle systems for machine learning and causal inference. And I think some of that she's going to talk about today. So currently, she's an assistant professor at NSAI in the statistics department. So with that, yeah, welcome, Anna, and looking forward to your talk.
Thanks a lot, Vincent, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation to the seminar series. So today I'll speak about some limitations of the theory of sampling with kernelized Wasserstein gradient flows. So it's a bit of a long title, but I try to present some work we did with colleagues on this Wasserstein gradient flows for sampling and some limitations we met during our studies. So, sorry about that. Yes. Okay. So I'll first present the problem we are focusing on, and we focus on the problem of sampling, which is often defined as following. So sample is to generate new examples from a target distribution that I will call pi over RD, given some information on pi. And you may find two different settings in the literature. The first one is you assume that pi's density with respect to Lebesgue measure is known up to a normalization constant z. So for instance, I know that pi of x is equal to pi tilde of x over z, but I do not know z. And this is the typical setting in Bayesian inference that I will present in the next slide. The second setting, I will not focus on this one, but just to mention it, is, for instance, so you want to sample to generate new examples from pi, but you have access to some samples of pi, x1 to xn. This is, for instance, the setting in generative modeling where you have access to true faces or images, and you want to generate new images according to the underlying distribution of our images. But in this talk, I'll focus on the first setting where I know the density of pi up to a normalization constant. And sorry, I forgot to say it again, but do not hesitate to ask questions during the talk to clarify things or notations. So what's the problem of Bayesian inference? Assume that you have some labeled data sets, D, of examples yi, such as images that are labeled, images wi that are labeled with yi, distributed as some data distribution. And you assume an underlying model on your data parameterized by theta. For instance, you assume that the label y is a function g of the input w, a parameter theta, plus some noise, for instance, distributed as a standard Gaussian. And the goal of Bayesian inference is not to learn the best parameter theta, as one would do in classical statistics. It's to learn the best distribution over theta to fit the observed data, the data set D. So how can you do this? Sorry about that. Let me just try something. Yes, it's better. So the first thing you should do is to compute the likelihood, which is the probability of observing your data set, given the parameter theta. As I assume I have independent data, it writes as this product over examples yi, wi, and I have assumed the Gaussian noise, so I can write the likelihood as follows. So it's proportional to this quantity, which is basically the sum of errors between true labels yi and what has been predicted by the model parameterized by theta for an input wi. Then you should choose a prior distribution on the parameter theta. For instance, you can assume that theta is distributed as P. So you choose P. So here I choose, for instance, P is a standard Gaussian, centered at 0 with variance identity. And then the goal of Bayesian inference is to update the distribution over theta given the data we have observed. And this can be done with Bayes' rule, where the target distribution here in my setting that I call pi will be the posterior distribution over the parameter, which is just the probability of theta given the data I have observed. By Bayes' rule, this is equal to the likelihood, the probability of the data given theta, times the prior distribution, the probability P of theta. And it should be divided by Z, the normalization constant, which is simply the same quantity, but integrated over all possible theta. But in practice, computing this Z is too expensive, so you cannot have access to it, and you remain with just the above expression, P of D given theta, P of theta. So in practice, you just know that the density of pi of theta is proportional to, in this case, with what I have chosen, exponential minus V, where V is this loss in the likelihood and this terms that comes from the prior distribution. All right, so this is my target distribution. I want to sample from pi. I know it's proportional to exponential minus V, and V is the sum of the data fitting term. How well do I predict for the parameter theta and some regularization term over theta? Any questions until here? All right. So why do we need to sample from theta? The first motivation is that we can predict, thanks to this posterior distribution over the parameter, as follows. So for instance, if I have a new input W, a new image, and I want to predict its label, the prediction will be an average prediction over all the models parameterized by theta. So one model is G of W, the input, and theta for one parameter theta, and you can average it over all reweighted by the posterior distribution, which is pi, so the probability of theta given your data set. So it's like averaging a lot of different models. So this gives an in-symbol prediction. And the second thing is that you can also use pi not only to predict only the new label, but to measure uncertainty on your prediction. And yes, so if you manage to sample from theta, you can, so here I denote this guy, for instance, theta j, samples of pi, sorry. You can construct a discrete measure, un, which is the empirical measure over this theta, and approximate this integral over theta over pi by this empirical sum, right? And the whole question of sampling, the whole community is focusing on building algorithms that will provide such a discrete approximation un. So just one slide for one motivation regarding this. So if you think about supervised learning, you want to predict for an image X one label. So here it's a probability of each label for each class. Now, if you have many models, you have many different theta that represent many neural networks, you can construct, you have access to a distribution over predictions, and you can average the predictions as follows. So, all right, so in this talk and in the line of work we did with some colleagues, we saw this sampling problem as an optimization problem over the space of probability distribution. The first, so where does it come from? It comes from the fact that pi, the target distribution, can be seen as the minimizer of, for instance, the Kullback-Leibler divergence between mu and pi, where mu is a probability distribution over order. So I just recalled the definition of the Kullback-Leibler divergence between mu and pi. So if mu is absolutely continuous with respect to pi, it's this integral of the log ratio of the densities integrated with respect to mu, and it's plus infinity otherwise. It's a divergence that measures the difference between mu and pi that is 0 only when mu is equal to pi. So it's an appropriate objective in the sense that it's indeed 0 only if mu equals pi. And you could have chosen actually any objective here, any divergence or distance between probability distributions that is cancelled only for mu equals pi. So we know this on pi. It seems trivial, but recall that I do not know pi entirely. I cannot evaluate exactly its density. I only know pi up to a normalization constant. I know the unnormalized density. And choosing the Kullback-Leibler divergence is interesting in this case because it does not depend on the normalization constant. Sorry. So the way you can see it is that if you plug pi, which is equal to pi tilde over z, and z is unknown, you plug it in this expression, you will remain with a log z, but it does not matter in your objective because you're minimizing over mu. So it basically does not depend on the normalization constant. So it's an appropriate objective in this setting. Yes, so in the literature, there are many ways to produce, let's say in a non-parametric way, an approximation UN, like a discrete measure approximating pi. The first one, the first big family of methods are Markov chain Monte Carlo methods. What they do is that they generate a Markov chain, so particles whose law will converge to pi, the target distribution. All right. So there are many MCMC methods. Maybe one of the most famous one is Langevin Monte Carlo, which discretizes in time a Langevin diffusion. So what is a Langevin diffusion? So I want a particle theta t. So Langevin diffusion is described as follows. So a particle theta t at each time is moved by the minus the gradient of v, where v is the potential in my target distribution, plus some Gaussian noise. So it's a particle that will evolve in a stochastic way. And as time goes by under mild assumptions on v, the law of this particle theta t will be pi. It will be the target distribution. And Langevin Monte Carlo is simply a time discretization of this Langevin diffusion. So it looks like gradient descent a bit. The particle at each time L is pushed by the step size times the gradient of v plus some Gaussian noise. And it's known that doing this, like the law of the Langevin diffusion in continuous time, corresponds to following a Wasserstein gradient flow of the Kullback-Leibler objective. So I will explain just after what are these objects, what are Wasserstein gradient flows, but basically it starts from here. Implementing a Langevin diffusion, the law of these particles follows a Wasserstein gradient flow of this objective. So it's doing this on the particle basically decreases your objective. So it's the motivation. But in our line of work, we didn't focus on Langevin Monte Carlo, but on other particle systems, another way to sample from pi through interacting particle systems that will either compute the gradient flow of the same function, the Kullback-Leibler, but with respect to other metrics than the Wasserstein one, or we will consider particle systems that are gradient flows of other functionals than the Kullback-Leibler divergence. Any questions before I go to the Wasserstein gradient flow part? No. Maybe just to mention, yes. Just to mention quickly, so as in optimization, the difficult cases will be when the potential v, so I recall that pi is proportional to exponential minus v, will be non-convex. So v of a parameter theta, we've seen it's typically the loss plus a regularization. And if v is convex, for instance, if you use a linear function, a simple model for your data, many sampling methods are known to work well. So either in practice or theoretically, we can obtain guarantees for, let's say, Langevin Monte Carlo. If it's not, if V is not convex, it's much more delicate. So for instance, this happens when G, the function you use to predict labels on your data, is a complex neural network. So it will not be convex at all in theta. So yeah, you can visualize it this way. And it's in this case, it's very hard to produce sampling methods that will provide good approximates of your data, of your posterior distribution. So either you can see it empirically, and on the theoretical side, it's very hard to show something as well. All right. So yes, just to recall the setting before I explain a bit Wasserstein gradient flows and the theory we need, is that we see the sampling problem as an optimization problem. And I will just restrict a bit the setting. I will assume that pi is not any probability distribution. It's a probability distribution with bounded second moment. It's still very general. And we see the sampling problem as minimizing a discrepancy between mu and pi that I see as a loss f, right? Because I fixed pi, so I want to optimize f over mu. And the idea of Wasserstein gradient flows is that if I start from an initial distribution mu0 in this space P2, over which I optimize, the goal will be to consider a Wasserstein gradient flow of the loss I want to optimize, f, over this space to transport basically mu0, the origin, the initial distribution, to the target pi. All right, so I will now present the setting, Wasserstein gradient flows, and in the 2 parts after, I will present some work and limitations we met. All right, so just yes, something one needs to understand before going to Wasserstein gradient flow is the concept of a continuity equation that I will try to explain in one slide. So I consider an example where I want to optimize the function v from Rd to R. And here I consider the Euclidean gradient flow, the one you should be used to, where a particle at time t is pushed by gradient v at xt. All right, so this describes the dynamics over my particle. And I have started from some point x0 in Rd. And this point, x0, has density mu0. And now I want to understand what is the dynamic of the density mu-t of my particle xt. So to see this, I pick a test function phi from Rd to R, and I compute the time derivative of the expectation of this function phi of xt, right? Xt is evolving through time, so I want to compute the time derivative of this quantity. And there are 2 ways to compute it. The first one is this line that I will explain, and the second one is this line. The first way I can compute it is to apply the chain rule. So I will have that the time derivative of this guy is the gradient of phi that I evaluate here, and x prime t, which is here the gradient of v. So here it's just applying the chain rule, integrated with the law of xt, and applying an integration by parts. You can obtain that it's the integral of phi times the divergence operator of mu-t, the law of xt, gradient of v. So believe me on this, but it's just applying the chain rule and integration by parts. The second way you can compute this time derivative is you will take the time derivative of mu-t, which is basically the density against which you integrate. And this time derivative is integral of phi, the test function, times the time derivative of mu-t of x. So you get 2 different expressions. So they are equal because you're computing the same thing. So this says basically you can write this equation that the time derivative of the density of the particle xt is equal to the divergence of the density mu-t times the vector field gradient v that pushes xt. And this equation is said to hold distributionally, which means that it holds for any test function phi that you will have this equality between integral of phi, what is on the right-hand side, equals integral of phi, what is on the left-hand side. Okay, so basically, what you should remember is that such an equation characterizes how the density mu-t of a particle xt evolves when the particle is pushed by a vector field gradient v. All right, let me know if you have questions, of course. So now I can explain Wasserstein gradient flows and the setting. So let me recall that the space on which I work on is P2, so the space of probability distributions with bounded second moments. And we equip this space with the Wasserstein 2 distance from optimal transport. Okay, and the Wasserstein 2 distance squared between two distributions mu and nu is defined as follows: it's the infimum so it's the infimum of the cost of transporting a particle x to y integrated by S, and S belongs to the set of possible couplings between nu and nu, the two distributions I'm considering. So basically, it's the cost of transporting a distribution nu onto a distribution mu, and it's a very famous distance in optimal transport. And yeah, I guess many people here are familiar with it. So there are several ways to write the Wasserstein distance. So this is one. An important one is the Benhamou-Brégnier formula, which writes as follows. So what it says is that you can find the shortest path, ρt, that will, so of distributions, right? Between, I want to interpolate between distribution nu and distribution nu at time 0 and 1. And it's the infimum over this path of the vector field. So this path of distribution is described by a similar equation as I've shown on the slide before. And the length of the path is measured by the squared norm of the vector field along this path. So it has basically a dynamic formulation on path connecting nu to mu. I'm showing this formula because at some point we'll see another metric than the Wasserstein one, and this metric will be very similar. And here, just notice that so the path of distribution is described by a continuity equation, and the vector field is a function from RD to RD. And here is it should be is the L2 norm of the vector field. So it's the integral of Vt squared with respect to ρt. All right, I just need to recall some other stuff on Wasserstein geometry, which is first the definition of a push-forward measure. So if I pick a distribution mu in P2 and T a measurable map, the push-forward measure is simply the image measure. So for instance, if I have a particle x distributed as mu, if I push x by the map T, it will be distributed as T push-forward mu. And an important result in optimal transport is Bregnier's theorem, which says that if you have two distributions mu and nu, such that the first one is regular enough, so absolutely continuous with respect to Lebesgue measure here, then you can find a map called T mu nu that will push the first distribution mu onto the second one, nu, and that realizes the Wasserstein 2 distance. And it's the third way to write a Wasserstein distance between mu and nu. It's the L2 norm between the identity and this path. So why am I presenting all of this? It's to provide you a simple way to write Wasserstein 2 geodesics and to have an intuition on the geometry behind Wasserstein gradient flows. Let's say I want to look at a geodesic between mu and nu, two distributions I'm considering. The Wasserstein geodesic, in this case, with the optimal transport map, can be written as a mixture map. So a mixture between the identity and this optimal transport map that pushes mu. So it's a horizontal interpolation that is represented on the right here. I don't know if you see my mouse, but on the right image, you push horizontally mu onto mu, you create a horizontal interpolation. And this is very different geometrically from a mixture between the two distributions that would be simply 1 minus t mu plus t nu. And in this case, it would be a vertical interpolation. You wouldn't displace all particles that build the first distribution onto the second one. You would have like teleportations. So it's something to understand on the Wasserstein geometry is that you push particles continuously through time. Yep. Oh, I'm already super late. All right, so I will just yes, I will present how a Wasserstein gradient flow can be written. And let's say I focus on optimizing a functional, for instance, the Kullback-Leibler divergence, as I've presented in the beginning. I can compute its differential. So it's a differential of a functional is defined this way. And it's a function from RD to R. So it's maybe the most intuitive notion of a gradient. And the Wasserstein gradient, the right gradient notion in the Wasserstein geometry, is a slightly different object. It will be the gradient of this function. All right, so it's the gradient of the differential. And it's a function from RD to RD. And it will be the vector field that characterizes a Wasserstein gradient flow of the functional f. So what you should remember from this slide is that if you want to build a Wasserstein gradient flow for the functional f, like a path of distributions that will decrease your objective f, it will be described by this equation. And we've seen that this equation describes how the density of particles evolve when these particles are pushed by this vector field, which is here the Wasserstein gradient of the function you want to optimize. So this Wasserstein gradient, it can be written generally functionals of interest, like the Kullback-Leibler divergence or many others. They can be written in as a sum of different terms. One that can be one which is called internal energy, the second one which is called the potential energy that will drive particles to the high density regions. Recall that V is the potential of pi, the target, and an interaction energy. And it's possible to write quite easily the Wasserstein gradient flows, so this path of distributions that decrease f. And in space, here I take the example where h, the internal energy, is 0. This equation describes, as I've said before, how the density mu t of particles xt evolves when these particles are pushed by, here I have gradient of the potential, and here I have an interaction energy. And so this term will push particles to high probability regions of the target. And this term represents an interaction between particles because here I have an interaction term between xt, the particle at which I'm looking, and other particles x, where x are distributed as mu t, which is also the law of xt. All right. So now I know that this process corresponds to equation 1, which implements a Wasserstein gradient flow of f. So basically, if I want to construct a sampling algorithm from a Wasserstein gradient flow, the only thing I have to do is to discretize this process in time and space. And this is what I will show now. So there are two ways to discretize in time. If I choose some step size gamma, you can either do at each time L a kind of proximal iteration, which basically says at each iteration, I want to minimize my objective plus some penalization term here in Wasserstein distance between mu and the previous iterate mu L. But as in optimization, these proximal operators are generally expensive. It's expensive to compute this minimum. And what we want to do, which is maybe the most direct way for many people here, is to do a kind of gradient descent, is to do a forward iteration. And at each step, mu L plus 1, basically we'll implement a kind of Riemannian gradient descent step. So mu L plus 1 is the previous iterate mu L, which is pushed by a map, which is here identity minus gamma, the gradient of the objective f at time L. And so yeah, you can understand this as Riemannian gradient descent, but basically in space, applied to particles, it corresponds to this equation. So if I have a particle XL distributed as mu L, at each time, this particle XL is pushed by the gradient of my objective f, evaluated at mu L, the distribution of XL, itself evaluated at XL because this is a function. So this is what I want to do because I want to apply, I want to decrease my functional f by pushing particles through this vector field. And here there is an issue because this iteration, this gradient descent of my objective function f, it depends on the law of the particle XL, and I do not know it. And the only way to approximate it is to simulate this density of the process by a set of particles. So this is what people do. We do not know mu L, the density of the particle at time L, and you can replace the process, so one particle, by a set of particles, so typically n, and you start with n particles distributed with the initial distribution, and then you push each particle, j, between 1 and n, by the following iteration where we have just replaced the true distribution mu L that we do not know by the empirical distribution of the particles. Okay, so this is a kind of approximation of the previous process that we cannot implement. And that's basically a sampling algorithm. You have chosen an objective f, you have discretized in time and space, and this is your algorithm. All right, any questions until here? All right, so I can now present two algorithms that are based on these concepts. And yeah, you'll see, I try to highlight what are the good and bad parts of this. So the first, so I said in the beginning that Langevin Monte Carlo was known to be a time discretization of a Wasserstein gradient flow, but it's known since 1998 from a paper by Jordan, Kinderlehrer, and Otto, basically. But I don't know if it was a bit forgotten or something, but yeah, in sampling, it was not so exploited. And then this paper, Stein-Wasserstein gradient descent, came out in 2016, and is built on similar ideas. So we'll see now why. So yeah, let me recall that I want to sample from pi. I know pi up to normalization constant. I do not know z. And I can see pi as the minimizer of the Kullback-Leibler. And I'm interested in doing gradient descent of the Kullback-Leibler divergence as an optimizer would do. And I want to implement this iteration. And we've seen that this iteration depends on UL, which is the density of XL. And the Wasserstein gradient of the Kullback-Leibler, how can it be written? So it's the gradient of the differential. That's what I've shown before. And the differential of the Kullback-Leibler is simply log mu over pi. A simple way to see it is that the Kullback-Leibler is this quantity here, integral of log mu over pi d mu. So if you differentiate with respect to mu, basically you will remain with log mu over pi plus constant. And you take the gradient of it, so that's how we obtain this expression. So if I want to implement this iteration, I need to approximate gradient log mu over pi at each time L. And we do this with particles. So Stein-Wasserstein gradient descent, it uses to do this, it uses ideas from kernels. So kernels from reproducing kernel Hilbert spaces. So I will, sorry, I need to introduce what they are, but it's quite simple. A kernel is simply a similarity function from RD to RD times RD to R, which is positive semi-definite. I recall the definition here. You can think of many kernels, many similarity functions. The most famous is the Gaussian kernel. So if X and Y are very similar, the kernel will be very high. And with one positive semi-definite kernel, you can define a set of corresponding functions, which is called a reproducing kernel Hilbert space. And it's simply the closure of all linear combinations of kernel functions. So you can see that if your kernel has some properties like smoothness, boundedness, and so on, this space, this RKHS, will inherit a lot of properties from the kernel. So it's a Hilbert space of function equipped with an inner product and a norm, and it's under Mild assumptions on the kernel. It's always included in L2 of mu, which is a space of function that I presented in the beginning. That's important. And the last thing to know is that it satisfies the reproducing property. So if you pick a function f in the RKHS and a point x in RD, the function f evaluated at x is the dot product between f and the kernel function evaluated at x. So these are two functions in the RKHS, and you can write this. So this was RKHS theory in one slide. And now I can present SVGD. So what it does is that it will implement the gradient flow of the Kullback-Leibler, the objective I'm considering, but with respect not to the Wasserstein metric, but with respect to a kernelized Wasserstein metric. And basically, the metric is the following. It's the same one. It's the same formulation as the Wasserstein distance that I've presented at the beginning, but where the norm of the vector field is not measured in L2 norm, as the Wasserstein would do, but with respect to RKHS norm, right? So it's a different norm. And it has been shown in previous papers that choosing this metric will, you can write the gradient flow of the KL as the following equation, where this guy, this gradient log mu over pi is the gradient of the KL, will be smoothed by this operator P mu T. And this operator, P mu, basically it takes a function and it convolves it with the kernel and reweighted by mu. So it's a kind of preconditioner. You change the metric on the space and you precondition the gradient that you will apply to the particles. And it's known that this equation converges to, the solution of this equation converges to pi in a continuous time. All right. So the trick of SVGD is to apply this operator, P mu, to the gradient of the Kullback-Leibler. And the nice thing, so if you just write the definition of this operator applied to the gradient, we can expand gradient log mu, gradient log pi, and this term in gradient log mu can be simplified as gradient mu, because gradient log mu is gradient mu over mu. You simplify it with the mu here. You obtain this expression, and then you can apply an integration by parts. And you obtain basically an integral over mu of some function that you can compute because it only relies on gradient log pi that you know, because pi is known up to a normalization constant, and the gradient of the kernel. So it's nice because now you can apply it to discrete measures. So if you have an interacting particle system, you have n particles, you can write this vector field in closed form, right? You can exactly evaluate it. And that's what SVGD does. It simply computes this equation where each particle is pushed by the step size times this vector field that is evaluated on the empirical measure over particles. So it's a very extremely simple algorithm. So just to mention quickly, it's a very simple algorithm that came out in 2016. The paper has now like 600 citations. It has relative empirical success in Bayesian inference, and recently in deep ensembles, like Vincent here has many nice papers on the subject. But it also suffers in practice from some issues when your target distribution is multimodal, or there are some problems on the estimated provides. But I do not have time to talk about this today. But still, it's a very nice algorithm, and that has shown nice empirical success. So we wanted to analyze this algorithm and to understand, can we use the optimization point of view to derive guarantees on SVGD? And the final result is no, and I will try to explain why. So this is the PD I want to analyze, the partial differential equation. And the first question one can ask is how fast the objective decreases along this path mu t. Once again, you can apply the chain rule in the Wasser chain space, but as you would do in the Euclidean space, and it's simply the gradient of the function, so the Kullback-Leibler, scalar Vt, the vector field, because it's the time derivative of particles. And this quantity can be written as basically the squared norm of the vector field that you apply to the particles. And this guy, this quantity here, is the Kern-Eckstein discrepancy between mu t and pi. So it's a positive quantity, so which says that your objective, the Kullback-Leibler, decreases along this path. So that's good. That's what we were waiting from Wasserstein gradient flows. And we can actually say, oh, I recognize this guy, the Kern-Eckstein discrepancy, and it's a divergence that is known from basically the same time, 2016, that can measure discrepancy between two distributions. It has some nice properties. Yes. So just to mention, it can be written as a kind of Fisher divergence, thanks to the reproducing property. But it's not maybe the most important here. And so what, if you want to prove convergence, the first idea is to look at the possibilities of exponential decay along the flow. That's something that has been done in sampling, for instance, for the analysis of Langevin Monte Carlo, and that a lot of people tried to do here for SVGD under such a condition. For instance, if you assume that the target pi satisfies this inequality, Stein-Loxobolev, basically that says that the objective Kullback-Leibler is upper bounded by the Kern-Eckstein discrepancy, the thing that was appearing when looking at the dissipation along the flow, then this gives exponential convergence along the flow, because you can write that the dissipation is minus the KSD squared. That's what I've shown on the previous slide. And now you can use your assumption on pi, the fact that this inequality holds, and you can integrate basically this inequality between the time derivative of the KL and the KL. And this says that the KL converges exponentially fast to 0. So that's good. However, such an inequality, such an hypothesis on pi, basically never holds. I mean, it's very hard for the vast majority of kernels and targets pi. Like if you have pi, which is a Gaussian, and k, which is bounded, which is the most common case, then it doesn't work. Yes, and just because I'm running out of time, what we did with colleagues and what we wanted to do is to combine, was still to use this inequality, but we didn't understand at that time to what extent it was restrictive, because we obtained what is called the descent lemma, which shows that at each time the objective decreases. So that's summarized in the proposition here in gray. At each time L, we could show that the Kullback-Leibler divergence decreases by a quantity proportional to the step size and the norm of the vector field. So that's a typical result in optimization. But for this, we needed assumptions such as boundedness of the kernel. So that's true for a Gaussian kernel, for instance. All right, and we wanted to, sorry, I will skip that, sorry. We wanted to combine it with, we wanted to combine our result, the descent lemma, which is this decrease at each time, with the Stein-Loxobolev inequality. Because we would have obtained the following equation. So we could have said that the decreasing was proportional to the square norm, and here used the Stein-Sobolev that relates this Kernel-Stein discrepancy with the Kullback-Leibler divergence. And in this case, we could have iterated this inequality and obtained linear rates for the Kullback-Leibler divergence. So that was our idea. That's a typical approach in optimization for the analysis of gradient descent in optimization, for instance, or for Langevin Monte Carlo. But it was not possible to combine both due to basically we need boundedness of the kernel, and boundedness of the kernel kills the Stein-Sobolev inequality. So we cannot do this, and it remains an open question to derive rates of convergence for SVGD since the algorithm came out. And yeah, it was very frustrating because in practice, if you plot the evolution of the Kullback-Leibler divergence, you indeed observe such a fast decay. But yeah, it's an open question. All right, I have, sorry, yeah, let me think, I will skip that. Just, so Vincent, should I use the whole 15 minutes?
Feel free to use as much time as you need. But yeah, I guess it's also good to leave some time for questions. So
I'll try to present part of this work in 5-10 minutes.
Sounds good.
So I hope, yeah, so this part one, what I wanted to highlight was that, okay, this particle system, SVGD, came out, it's very nice, it works very well. So in many cases, let's say, even if it has some issues, but its analysis is still an open question. At least the optimization point of view was not sufficient to analyze it. So now I want to present the second work where we also met some issues, both on the empirical and theoretical aspects, and still with this sampling as optimization point of view. Yes, so what we did is that we took the Kernel-Stein discrepancy between mu and pi directly as the objective function. So we forget about the Kullback-Leibler divergence. That's not my objective function anymore. Now I want to optimize directly the Kernel-Stein discrepancy between mu and pi. And I've mentioned it quickly, but I said that this guy, this kind of kernelized Fisher divergence, is an appropriate discrepancy between probability distributions. And I won't have time to detail the computation, but you can write this Kernel-Stein discrepancy basically as the last line here, as a double integral over mu, the first distribution, of some kernel that depends on pi. And that's very nice because this kernel that depends on pi, it's basically what is here in blue. It's a kernel that depends on some basic kernel K, like a Gaussian kernel, and the score of pi, this gradient log pi. So if you have access to gradient log pi, you can compute it. And if mu is discrete, you can compute this double integral. So it's a kind of very tempting discrepancy for Bayesian inference because pi, you know gradient log pi, and you work with discrete measures, so you can evaluate this objective for any discrete measure. So we wanted to optimize this directly, and actually this looks like a discrete finite optimization, in the sense that if you write the KSD for discrete measures, it's basically a loss over n points, and you can optimize this loss over n points. And the Wasserstein gradient flow of the Kullback of the KSD is basically equivalent to applying gradient descent on the positions of the particle. So that's what we did. And the line here of KSD descent, algorithm 1, is the most simple algorithm you could think of. You just push the particles through this gradient of the KSD. And it's a nice loss. You can evaluate the gradient in closed form, the loss in closed form. So you can use like nice optimization tricks such as LBFGS that does not require the choice of a step size. So it's a very simple algorithm. We were quite happy with that. And so I skip that. And if you check its performance on a Gaussian, it works very well. So here I have a two-dimensional Gaussian, green points are initial position, and so SVGD converges to the Gaussian, but KSD as well. And here is just the LBFGS improvement. So it works very well on Gaussian, but now if I test it on mixtures of Gaussians, I can have issues. For instance, if the modes, if the standard deviation is very small, and I initialize the points in green near an axis of symmetry between the modes, then the final positions in blue, I can remain stuck on this axis. So that's very bad. Here, on the right-hand side, if I initialize, so green points are a bit more spread around the axis of symmetry, it's better. Some of the particles converge to the modes, but still some of them are stuck. So that's not good. Normally, I should have no particles here because it's like a very low probability here. So yeah, we were not happy with this. And yeah, these are, basically this shows that it happens more when, I mean, it gets better when the variance of the Gaussians are great, or sorry, are big. But yeah, one idea we had is to correct this problem with tempering, like to use a temperature that flattens the target distribution at initialization and then recovers it. And that helps. If you use such a strategy, you will obtain what you want for a mixture of Gaussians here. We can see that the points indeed cover the modes of the distribution, and I have no more particles stuck. So that was good. But it's not sufficient. In practice, when we tested on log concave, like convex potentials, real-world task, it worked. And for, so that's the case of Bayesian logistic regression. And when we tested on non-convex problems, like Bayesian and CA, KSD descent performed very bad, as good as random, whereas SVGG was performing quite good. So we can see that there is a big difference between the performance on the Gaussian case, or like convex potential case, versus the non-convex one. And actually, we saw that it works more generally than in the convex potential case. That's the case of, for instance, if you consider a banana distribution, or a horseshoe distribution, it's not log concave, the potential is not convex, but still KSD descent works. So it's a bit more general, but we don't know why. And yes, just to summarize the theoretical findings, because we tried to understand what was happening. So we could show theoretically that there's no problem in the ideal continuous case. For instance, if you have full supported measure at stationary t, when time goes to infinity, if this stationary measure is full support, then the loss is 0, which means that you have attained the target. But in practice, we work with discrete measures, so we are not in this setting. So it does not describe what happens in reality. We could show what happens when Y particles are stuck. We show basically that if the particles are in the axis of symmetry at time 0, then they will be stuck there. So that's for the bad side. But we tried to understand when does it work. So for instance, for Gaussians, like or more generally the concave case. And we took these 3 points of view, which are the most common ones in optimization or optimal transport. We tried to look at, for instance, the geometry of the objective. Do we deal with the convex objective? In optimization, it's very important to be convex. So here the right notion is convex with respect to the Wasserstein geometry. And it's not true that the KSD is geodesically convex. So that does not explain convergence. We tried to look at, okay, maybe it's not convex, but near the target pi, it has a good curvature. This is not true neither. So this didn't work. And then we tried to identify a functional inequality, such as the Stein-Sobolev inequality I presented before, that would explain how fast we decrease along the flow. And we could identify such a functional inequality, but this does not help understanding what happens in practice. I have not the time to explain it here, but it's basically useless. So yeah, it didn't work. So we remain ignorant about why does it work sometimes. So I will skip that and go to the conclusion. So what I tried to present here, so the title Kernelized Wasserstein gradient flows refers to these two works. One, so SVGD, that provides the gradient flow of the Kullback-Leibler with respect to a kernelized Wasserstein distance, or the Kernelstein discrepancy that implements the Wasserstein gradient flow, but of this kernelized Fisher divergence. So this mixing of kernels and Wasserstein gradient flows IDs enable to design deterministic interacting particle systems. And these particle systems actually can provide a better approximation of the target for a finite number of particles. So that's something I didn't show here, that I can show on some images. But if you look at, in the end, how this particle system look like, at stationarity, they provide a very regular approximation of the target distribution, which is very different from, let's say, MCMC iterates. So that's one thing. And theory does not match practice yet. And that, at least this optimization point of view that we tried to take, like to transfer these optimization ideas, either in practice or in theory, are not always a good idea. And yes, on the numeric side, that's not something I discussed here a lot, but many things can be improved through perturb dynamics or change of geometry. And yes, regarding the numerics, we have a Python package to try KSD descent. There are also code for SVGD. And yeah, it's very simple to use and to try these if you're interested. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Cool, thanks a lot. That was a really interesting talk. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions from the chat, but maybe in the meantime, while we give the participants some time, maybe I can start off with a question that, yeah, it's kind of in the spirit of this seminar series that we have here. We care a lot about, discrepancies between theory and practice, and I think that's something that you've touched upon quite a lot in your talk. And so I guess I'm wondering, apart from the particular cases that you talked about, right, like these Loxobolov assumptions and stuff, do you think there's a lot of theory in that particular field going on where people maybe ignore a little bit whether their assumptions hold in practice, or that people kind of, purposefully make assumptions that are not super realistic for the just purpose of getting theoretical results? Or what's your general feeling about how much people care about the realism of the assumptions, basically?
So very interesting question. So I would say, for instance, that for instance, in the Langevin Monte Carlo literature, the most common assumptions on the potential V, so pi is proportional to x minus V, people generally consider like smooth V and strongly log concave V. And that's quite restrictive, for instance, but it holds for Gaussian targets. So that's, and it's a bit more general. So that's typically assumptions that people consider in this literature. And it's quite recent, for instance, to obtain guarantees for potentials V that are not convex, but only smooth, for instance. So I know some people like Adil Salim, my colleague, has been working on this recently, and it's quite recent to obtain guarantees in the non-convex case, which, for instance, targets a lot of applications such as Bayesian neural networks. In this case, you do not have a convex V. So I would say that people generally focus still on realistic assumptions for the convex case, but as soon as you leave the non-convex case, it has not been so considered, I would say. And otherwise, the functional inequalities I presented here, for instance, these tools are actually more general than the notions of convexity. For instance, the equivalent thing in optimization is called the Polyaklo-Yazevich inequality. And if your function satisfies this, a convex function will satisfy, a strongly convex function will satisfy a Polyaklo-Yazevich inequality. So these inequalities are more general. So they enable to deal with more general cases. So they can be seen as relaxations of this. So these assumptions are not like weird or how to say, just toy objects. They are really here to generalize to general targets.
Cool. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I guess another question that's in that vein, maybe not relating to the assumptions so much, but the actual optimization targets. So I guess we were seeing different divergence measures, right? There was the KL, there was the Wasserstein distance, there was the KSD and so on. So I guess, is there some argument for which one of those is realistically more useful in some sense, or is it more like you choose for each application a different one depending on what you want? Or yeah, I guess there's also then again the similar question, right? Do people choose these measures because they're theoretically more tractable, or is it because they're actually useful in a certain way?
So to me, there are three reasons to choose the functional, like what information you have on the target. So if you're on the Bayesian setting, choosing the Kullback-Leibler or KSD makes sense, but not other losses such as Wasserstein distance or MMD, because you need integrals over pi, you need already samples over pi. So it depends on first the information you have on pi. Second, I would say the nice properties of the objective. So for instance, I've shown that the KSD it's not convex basically for a convex target, for let's say a Gaussian, but the Kullback-Leibler is if you have a Gaussian target, like if you have more generally a log concave target, the Kullback-Leibler inherits this and is geodesically convex. So it's a nice optimization objective. So there are these geometric properties of the objective. And the third aspect, I would say, is practical, in the sense that, for instance, if you apply Langevin Monte Carlo or Stein-Vachon gradient descent, you still have to tune the step size, and it's quite annoying in practice. You have to try different step sizes. And some losses, such as the Carnage-Stein discrepancy descent, with these losses, because they can be evaluated exactly for discrete measures, and their gradient as well, you can use tricks such as LBFGS. So it's not something I detailed here, but it's a nice optimization algorithm that automatically chooses the step size. So on the practical side, the Kullback-Leibler might be less practical than the KSD. So yeah, these three aspects I would say are should drive the choice of the discrepancy.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah. Are there any questions from the participants? Feel free to post into the chat. Otherwise, if that's not the case, I'm happy to thank Anna again, and maybe we can stop the recording